It's a very tough war as it gets into winter. The conflict is incredibly intense, and the houses have fallen down, but they have a well in their garden. They can get wood for heating. Russia is lying about a lot of what it does. And I give one easy, simple example. This is what professional journalists do. I wish, and as a lot of other people do, that we could learn the lessons of history and not repeat wars.
Welcome to Infertalks, where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining us today is a renowned name in conflict reporting. He has covered issues ranging from Pakistan, Afghanistan, the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and many more. He has also been an essential source of information coming out from the Russia-Ukraine conflict that is happening right now. Mr. Nic Robertson, International Diplomatic Editor for the CNN. Mr. Robertson, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to start off with our first question. We see that the Russia-Ukraine war has been the most covered story in global media throughout the last year. We've seen developments through the war become a mainstay as a top story for publications and media houses all over the world. And there has been a lot of news reporting as well as policy reporting on the issue. Now, what I'd like to ask you is that as one of the most credible names in global journalism, and perhaps even more importantly, someone who has actively been present in the context before and also during the conduct of hostilities, could you give us a first-hand sort of an insight to what's happening on ground right now?
Yeah, it's a very tough war as it gets into winter. You know, I think what we witnessed at the beginning of the year when the invasion began was a huge amount of uncertainty. Would Russia really be able to take control of Ukraine? And what we've seen is that Putin made massive miscalculation that his troops weren't able to do it, and the support that if he thought he had it in Ukraine, wasn't there. So today the war's in a very different place. And I think we can define it as sort of two principal places. There's the front line in the east of the country, which is perhaps close to, 1,000 kilometers long. Some bits are very active and some bits aren't. There are areas in the east of the country, like Bakhmut, where the conflict is incredibly intense. And near those front lines, there's a huge amount of shelling and a huge amount of danger to civilians, and quite a high casualty rate among troops on both sides. It's a really high attrition war in terms of artillery, rocket fire, injury of soldiers, death of soldiers, destruction of property. So in the east of the country, and as that tracks sort of from the north to the south of Ukraine, you have a high level of damage. And then, within 20, 30 miles of the front lines, you have communities that are very much caught up in the war itself. They are affected. A lot of the population's gone. Most of the services, gas, electricity, water, are all gone. And people there's perhaps only a quarter of the population left, and they struggle. They really struggle. And then there's the other part of the war that Russia started at the beginning of October with these huge shellings, both cruise missiles and drone attacks that have targeted the energy infrastructure, not just the power generation, but a real systematic targeting of, how a national grid holds the power for the country together, that it can see what the electricity needs are in the south and the east and the north, and etc. of the country, and can balance the supply against the need. That technical capacity has also been very systematically targeted. So you have this whole now war campaign against the civilian population going into winter. So you have huge pockets of the country don't have running water, major urban areas where big amounts of the population are, major urban areas without heating, without lighting, without water. And that's creating a lot of hardship and there's repair work, but it's attritional. So there's this real effort to degrade the way that people can live. But I think the thing that you see in all these places, and I think this gets to your question, is on the Ukrainian side, an incredible resilience, because people feel that this is their country and they're under attack.
Right.
And they have this fortitude that despite the deprivations, they will continue to live through and hold on to their country and try and take back those bits they've lost.
So you're saying civilian morale is also quite high in support of the forces. But I would like to talk a bit about some of the casualties that the military forces also incur. So you were recently, you've covered a wide range of conflicts through the years in Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, Pakistan as well, and all over the Middle East. How is your experience of reporting on the conflict in Ukraine comparable to some of them? And has your experience been mostly the same, or has there been something that has been standing out for you in this?
Yeah, I think every conflict has a uniqueness, the characteristics, the idea behind the war or the conflict, the scale of the conflict. All these things are sort of different in different environments. And I suppose when I'm answering that question, one of the things that's changed also is time. I've been doing this for more than 30 decades, right. So I've sort of seen an evolution in warfare across that time, you know, from being in Iraq, let's say, during the first Gulf War in 1991, when the United States was using cruise missiles, you know, against Iraq. The cruise missile, a highly sophisticated, directionable, smart weapon that has a massive explosive capability. In Afghanistan, for example, watching the Taliban take control back in the 90s and the refights that have gone on since then, often it's been just sort of a little bit of artillery duel, or it's been a low level of conflict, or in Bosnia, the front lines stayed the same. There was sniping, there was a little bit of shell fire. What there is in Ukraine is on a scale that I haven't seen before, because you have one of the major armies of the world and the weapons at its disposal against an ostensibly weaker nation that is now being supplied by partners and allies in the West. So you have a lot of weapon systems, the preponderance on the Russian side, but an increasing number on the Ukrainian side, that overarch all aspects of conflict that I've seen before. So you have the long-range weapons, you have the sophisticated cruise missiles, you have the drones. So nowhere is safe. But I think the biggest change in this conflict that I've seen is the use of drones to overfly frontline areas and the near frontline areas. And what they do is they provide a real-time image to the troops on the ground on either side of what the other forces are doing, which really improves targeting. It changes the dynamic on the battlefield. There's nowhere that you can stay hidden. The old idea that you could be on the mountaintop or you could be in the tree line in the forest and you could hide, that's gone. You can't hide in a trench. You can't hide in the trees anymore. Having the high ground isn't essential, because once you put a drone in the sky, it can see everything on the ground. And that's really changed the dynamic of this war. And I think made it, for reporters, probably, and for troops too, it's made it a much more dangerous environment.
One would think that, you know, such advancements in precision weaponry would lead to less and less civilian harm. But have you seen that unfolding in this situation or not?
Yeah, I think so. You know, precision weapons, you're absolutely right, will allow you to avoid civilian casualties, but it depends how you prosecute the war. What the Russians have been doing is not winning on the battlefield, not winning on the front line, losing territory, and switching to a tactic of actually targeting those civilian areas in a way that they weren't earlier on in the war. This was to take out, the power infrastructure. But even smart weapons fall short, get shot down, and injure civilians. So, along the front lines, it's sort of the old style of conflict that if the civilians are still there in their farms or their villages, then they're absolutely going to be in the line of fire and caught up in the military offensive around the front line. And that really happens. I mean, that's going on. Perhaps, the daily toll, we don't really get to see the whole daily toll for civilians, but it goes on, but it's probably not as bad as we might imagine. It's terrible and bad. People are dying, people are injured, people are losing limbs daily. But I think, the military losses are actually significantly much higher in this environment. But we've also seen, again, because of the precision targeting, probably a higher death rate than you would normally see. You might have averaged in the battlefield for every soldier killed, 5 injured. I think with the high precision targeting, the number killed relative to the number injured goes up.
That's interesting. And you rightly pointed out that, the numbers are still, coming out, they're still being collated and understood. And there's also an aspect of, casualty, an aspect of the impacts of conflict that affect the soldiers that are also involved in the conflict. And you were recently accompanying the Ukrainian army in their search for soldiers who went missing in one of the areas where the fighting has halted recently. And I just wanted to ask you what that experience was like, what you learned from that experience, and what does it look like when fighting sort of slows down and forces go in to do these rescue and search missions? What does that look like?
I think it really speaks to the ethos of the military and of the national spirit. And I think every country is like this. One of the strongest ethos on the battlefield for soldiers, whether it comes down from command level or it's the soldiers themselves, no one left behind. No one wants to die on a battlefield, and for their family never to have the solace to find out what happened to them, and be able to have a burial site and be able to bury them somewhere. That's a terrible tragedy when that happens, and that's a really strong ethos on the Ukrainian side, because again, this is for them, this is very much a sort of a national struggle of survival for their territory, for their country. It's felt very keenly. I think it's hard perhaps for people who look at this just as a war to really understand how much being attacked by Russia has changed the psychology of people in Ukraine. This once brotherly nation can never be brotherly nation again because of what's happening, and that's a huge tragedy. So this ethos of going in and looking for soldiers who've been lost in the battlefield, I found that to be really strong, and the people doing it, I found to be, very compassionate in what they were doing. One of the soldiers who was leading the team was speaking to the fallen soldiers, the dead soldiers. Come home, brother. We're going to help bring you home. Thanking them when he found identifying features like rings or like a passport or an identity document, because he knew that would help connect that soldier to the family. Yeah. But one of the interesting, fascinating things to me was that this army has gone into a war that it was never expecting to fight. It didn't ever have a unit like this that was dedicated to this sort of work. It wasn't at war, so you didn't have fallen soldiers in the battlefield to go and look for. Sure. And the people that are doing this job are have worked with museums, have worked with archaeologists, have worked with historical battlefields to help. So this is a sort of natural evolution of this team of people who have real professional skills, who can look at a situation on the ground and go, yeah, I think these soldiers were here, and unbelievably, you would have no idea. You would walk past them there and not have a single idea that there might be soldiers buried under there, because the grass has grown over and everything, and there they were.
That is so fascinating, and also so essential to preserving the dignity of those who are missing, or of those who've been lost to conflict. To conduct these exercises in a way where families end up having news of their loved ones. Um, so I'd like to ask you now on a more an aspect more related to your line of work, on conflict reporting, and I'd like to link it to humanitarian access right now. So, what is the access for journalists and reporters who are covering the conflict look like? What do the conditions of access and also safety look like for them? And are the parties to the conflict being respectful of their safety and their protection in the midst of war?
I think it's really, there are two complete different sides to this, because we don't have access to the Russian side. Getting a visa for Russia is hugely difficult. Well, it's been impossible for, since the conflict began. There are a few reporters who have existing credentials with the Russian authorities to have a visa, but that only gets them to Moscow. It doesn't give them access to the front line. So on the Russian side, it's very, very heavily controlled.
Right.
On the Ukrainian side, access to the country is easier. Access to the to the frontline areas is under the authority of the military in those zones. But that, in my experience, that's sort of typical of any conflict that you're in, that the military doesn't want you wandering around at the front line, disrupting the situation, putting yourself in harm's way, causing them difficulty and trouble. So there's a level of control on the Ukrainian side. You will get access to the front line when that unit can and feels that it's safe. For example, when we were in the east of the country recently, we were trying to go to the front line with different units, and we had various different agreements, different units to go. And then, we'd meet with them and plan to go the next day. And then on the morning, they would say, look, it's just too dangerous. So, we would go by ourselves to civilian areas near the front lines.
Right.
And yes, it was the shelling and the conflict in the east was really, really heavy. And at that time, the troops don't want to give you access. It comes through eventually, but you have to be more patient.
That makes sense. I mean, like, only when they're ready to ensure safety would someone sort of enable access like that. Does the same apply for humanitarian organizations in Ukraine? And how are they able to access affected populations who have these humanitarian needs that can be addressed by either by local or even international humanitarian actors? So what's the access and safety situation for them looking like?
They're in the conflict zone as well, and the same with us. There are no guarantees of safety. I don't think either side neither side is looking per se to see journalists on the ground. I mean, at a humanitarian level, I don't see a huge amount of respect. And I've only witnessed it on the Ukrainian side. I don't see a huge amount of respect for the humanitarian groups that are coming in. They're in as much danger. So you have a lot of different groups. You have kind of small volunteer groups, and I've seen them going into cities where there's shelling or towns where there's shelling, and getting out civilians, elderly or families who are trapped there.
Right.
And it really is just sort of try and get in fast and get out fast. And there's a huge appreciation for that. I think one of the stunning things on the Ukrainian side that I've seen is just how much support there is in the population to support those who are in the conflict area. So you have, bread handouts in some cities, you have food handouts, and all the sort of money to support that has been contributed by other Ukrainian citizens from other parts of the country who've come to help to do that. So there are really strong local networks to help out. But in terms of international support, in the town of Bakhmut, which has been under very, very heavy shelling for a long time, since the summer, organizations like the WFP have been able to deliver some food there, because the stores there are pretty much all shut, with a couple of exceptions. Once you get further away from the front lines, the food you can find in the stores, there's more of it. So you don't need that type of humanitarian distribution. But in terms of doctors and things like that, yes, we've definitely seen groups like MSF. I remember seeing them turn up in Kherson just after it was liberated, maybe 2 days, 3 days after it was liberated, and definitely Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, and other medical organizations are helping out in hospitals in Ukraine significantly, and they need that help, because there are more casualties than normal. You need more trauma doctors, and not all the doctors have been able to stay near the front lines. So yeah, but yes, I think on a humanitarian side, but it's not like if you compare the sort of scale of hunger suffering that you might see, for example, in Afghanistan.
Right.
So the sort of scale of support is not huge convoys of food going in, because indigenously in the country they're trying to provide what they can, financially and food wise. Yeah,
so that's probably because some of the systems are still in place and intact, and internally these needs can be addressed, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So while we're on the topic of the human impact of war, could you please tell us a little more about what the human cost of war you've witnessed in Ukraine over the last year, in your opinion, and how important is it for governments and policymakers to continue to stress on the importance of this real cost of conflict?
I think we're seeing that the biggest, broadest cost is really the fact that the electricity is being targeted, that the heating is off, that the water is off around the country. Because if you're living in a small village, you're sort of okay. I've been to villages that have been completely trashed by the war, met families who are literally living in the basements, and the houses have fallen down, but they have a well in their garden. They can get wood for heating. Some of the basic needs can be met. But in the cities, urban environment, big tower blocks, people don't have an open fire. They might be able to find a bit of wood, but they've got nowhere in their house to burn it. And I really think that this is putting this targeting, Russia's targeting of people's ability to withstand the cold in winter, is really highlighting the issue of the human suffering. And it may come to a point, and the Ukrainian government said, if they can't restore the power in major cities, then they would have to tell the population that please leave. But some people left earlier in the year. I've talked to people who've left, they've evacuated from their homes, but they've run out of money. So they have to go back to their homes and live with those hardships. They don't have a choice. So this problem is going to get more acute as the situation gets worse, it gets colder. People have run out of, their sort of savings, if you will. I was talking to some of the elderly people, a couple of old ladies I was talking to in the east of the country, telling me, they were born just before World War II, and they remember that. One lady was telling me, I remember after World War II, we had no clothes. She said, I was one of the first generation that went to school, and my grandparents literally, she said, had to tie rags around me so I could go to school. So it's a population that understands real hardship and suffering, but also they have that experience of war. Another old lady said to me, I was born into war and I'll die in war. she has no heating. So when the power goes off, I said, what do you do? She said, well, I just put a blanket around me and another coat and I go to bed. But that's, it's tough to survive a whole winter for a person who's in their 80s like that.
I can only imagine. And Mr. Robertson, have you felt that there's when particularly talking about the cost of human suffering, the human suffering caused by war, have you found any parallels or perhaps any divergences in your experience covering the Russia-Ukraine conflict as opposed to the conflicts that you've covered in the past, perhaps?
Yeah, I think this is it's a more modern society. It's a more well-connected society. I talked before about how, things, every place is different, situation is different, and how time has changed things. And time has changed things like communications, for example. When the phone network is working, I have an app on my phone, and so does everyone else in Ukraine, that will tell you when the air raid siren's going off. And often that air raid siren on your phone for where you are is going to go off even quicker than the physical ones that are out on the streets. There are differences there, I think, that I haven't witnessed before, that this is a very modern war being fought with modern weapons in a modern urban environment in Europe. And this is on a scale, 1,000-kilometer front line, on a scale that hasn't been witnessed for several generations. I think these are, when I think about how this is different, it's a very modern war with a very modern population.
Thank you. That's some very interesting insight. So now I'm going to move on to a couple of other things that we want to touch upon a little bit. So one of the things that we've noticed of late is a trend of increasing polarization in press and news media. And many would say that the control of information, narratives, strategic communications, and downright propaganda, if you will, has become essential tools of warfare. And in this particular case, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the West and Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian allies have blamed Russia for their excessive dependence on misinformation and propaganda. And then on the flip side, we see Russian officials and Russian authorities, Russian allies, saying that the Western media and their coverage of this conflict is inherently biased against Russia. So as a journalist, what do you think the role and responsibility of the media is through such troubling and, dare I say, confusing times? And how can the average global citizen find their way to the truth and reality of what is happening in the conflicts of today?
It's so much harder because there's so much misinformation and false information out there that's so hard for people to check. I mean, I think in days gone by, you had broadcasters or friends that you would talk to, or broadcasters that would provide information that you knew was accurate to the best of their abilities. And I think you had that sense of security in that knowledge. Now there's such a free flow of information that can't be checked, that is inaccurate, that is downright lies at times. That it is a challenge for people, and I think, and I recognize that for them. I think, stick to professional broadcasters whose reputation depends on their, on the way that they're scrutinized, on the way that they're analyzed, on the facts that they have. I mean, we at CNN have a huge department that will make sure that what we're saying is factually accurate. We have the sources, to back up what we're saying, and I'll say this very clearly and squarely because I think it's hugely important for people to understand. Russia is lying about a lot of what it does. And I give one easy, simple example. Just before Kherson fell, the Russians said that, well, the power went off and the Russians blamed it on the Ukrainians. This is just one example of many, many, many situations. The Russians blamed it on the Ukrainians. But when people were able to get to the power generating site that had been destroyed, it was very clear that this had been blown up by the Russians, not struck by missiles, but the two big generators blown up and the transmission equipment blown up.
Right.
So Russia has a real credibility deficit, and perhaps it's fallen foul of its own misinformation. As I said before, President Putin went into this conflict thinking it was going to be an easy one to win because he thought the Ukrainian population would support him, and he thought there would be an easy military victory. The information that President Putin had was not good information, and because information doesn't flow well to an autocrat like President Putin, because no one in the country is rewarded for telling the truth. He has taken control of the information in Russia such that no one can criticize it or offer an alternative view. That does not predispose a nation to getting good information. It doesn't predispose the leadership of that nation to give good and accurate information. But just leave that thought because I think it's an important thought. Yeah. But I think it's absolutely fair to say, in every conflict, there is always propaganda. I mean, it's quite an old expression that the first casualty of war is the truth. Absolutely. Both sides engage in propaganda, and part of it is to build up, support on their own side. War's not easy. Getting young men and women to go fight in the front lines is not an easy thing to do. You need to have a strong narrative, and we saw how President Putin has lost that narrative when he tried to have a conscription. He's conscripted a lot of people, but hundreds of thousands of people fled the country. You cannot ignore or re-diagnose thousands of cars and people crossing the borders out of the country, young men, as something else than an absolute clear reaction to what the leadership is doing. So it's important for the leadership to have a narrative. You don't have that problem in Ukraine of young men running away, trying to get away from fighting the war. Of course, a lot of them don't want to do it. And I think there's another thing as well in information in war. You have the basic propaganda, but also both sides are very smart about trying to use and release information in strategic ways to shape what the other side is thinking. And I think there's a classic way that this happened in the war here, where the Ukrainians talked in the summer, at the end of the summer, a lot about an offensive in the south, and this is where it was going to be. And, there was a lot of attention, a lot of journalists moved to the south to cover this expected offensive in the south. And I remember speaking to a government official who said, yes, it's going to be happening in a couple of days and weeks. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going north and east. Am I going to the wrong part of the country? Well, guess what? A few months later, the Ukrainian forces took a big swath of territory in the north and east of the country. They sent hugely clear signals by using misinformation told to Western journalists, told to the international community, told to whomever, to create the impression on the Russian side that that the offensive was in the south and not the north and the east. And that was successful. And as a journalist, and this comes back to the core of your question, this is a profession and you hold yourself to high standards, and you have to try to filter out, what is propaganda, what is psychological operations against the other side, what is intentional misinformation. You really have to think hard about that and examine what you see on the ground. So to answer your question again, as professional journalists, what we did was go to the south, drive along as close as we could to the front lines and see if there was any military activity. And nothing that we saw gave an indication about the message that there was going to be a big offensive. But when we went to the north and east of the country, it was militarily busy. There are easy ways to see this: the amount of troops, the amount of vehicles on the road, the amount of dirt on the road, of vehicles coming off of fields,
Right.
all these sorts of things. So again, to your question, there are professionals like us who are out in the field with an absolute commitment to telling the truth, who will put themselves in danger to find out what's happening. You know, when the days when I was talking to you about the fact that the Ukrainian troops wouldn't let us get close to the front line because he said it was dangerous,
Right.
we went as close as we could, separately, individually ourselves, and got shells landing very close to us, to see for ourselves what was happening, to test what we were being told.
Right.
This is what professional journalists do, and this is what I urge audiences to do: to seek out professional journalists whom you trust, not rumor mongers, not propagandists, not ultranationalists, not populists, who've all got their own agenda. Our agenda as journalists is to get to the truth and tell it to the best of our abilities. I'm passionate about this because it's what I earnestly believe in.
I can tell from the way that you speak about it that it comes from a place of passion. And honestly, I feel like we do not credit the kind of work that goes into bringing credible information out to people who have their eyes set on what is happening in these situations where people like you are the primary source of information for us. So before we come back to the Russia-Ukraine war, we'd like to spotlight one of the complaints we've heard coming from the regions not so closely linked to this war. It has been about the disparity between the attention given to the Russia-Ukraine conflict as opposed to other conflicts that are ongoing in the world right now. Do you think there is a risk of the world missing out on important possible flashpoints around the globe, as so much attention and energy is reserved for the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a real strain on politicians and leaders in the world, because they only have the same number of hours in a day as us. They can't multiply themselves out. So there is a real risk that, because of the high tensions that exist in the conflict, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and what Russia continues to talk about, the potential of making this a nuclear war. I'm not sure that I entirely believe that, but you cannot disallow that point. And I think this conflict can have a huge impact, and is having a huge impact, on the global economy and the lives of many citizens, and that it necessarily is consuming a lot of attention. But absolutely, there is so much happening in the background in other places, people making decisions based on what they see here. The other signals, other diplomatic signals, can be missed, or people can use this time while attention is diverted on this conflict, international attention is diverted, to kind of try to achieve their agendas in other places. I mean, just as an example, COVID drew our attention away from a number of things, but during COVID, both President Xi in China and President Putin in Russia used that period while the world wasn't paying so much attention to lock in power, autocratic power, for much longer. But I think your point is a slightly different one. So, what happens because of climate change, something Pakistan has suffered from, and hugely so this year. But at a moment when the conflict switch gears in Ukraine, at a moment when President Putin started targeting the Ukrainian citizens and the power infrastructure, just when Pakistan was having these huge floods that needed international attention switched away. And that's not beneficial to the people of Pakistan, and it's not beneficial in terms of having world attention focused on the big destructive issue that faces the whole planet, climate change.
Truly.
Far better to have people focus on that. No, I absolutely agree. I mean, wars are destructive. They they kill people, they ruin societies, they hurt the economy. And I wish, and as a lot of other people do, that we could learn the lessons of history and not repeat wars, because ultimately they're not going to benefit anyone, or maybe a handful of individuals. And what we need to do is work together as a planet to look and try to solve the issues of climate crisis. There are so many issues right now, whether it's tensions over Taiwan, whether it's tensions over the India-China border, whether it's the economies in sub-Saharan Africa, wherever the tensions are, the help and assistance that might come to ameliorate those issues is being diverted. I personally don't believe that you can blame European governments and the US government for what they're doing right now. This is a massive issue that threatens them by a leader who refuses democratic values, who won't give a democratic voice to his people, that is trying to take territory through old military means, hardcore take territory away from people that would rather have democratic values, that would rather not have their country run by people that are essentially running criminal cartels that are making money through criminal enterprises. I suppose the word I'm searching for here is corruption. What the people of Ukraine wanted was an economic model that wasn't corrupt like the economic model that Russia's offering. And that's what they're trying to choose. And they're trying to choose it through democratic values. So this is a real struggle between allowing an autocrat to trample over democratic values, because democratic values say that we should talk, that we should engage, that we should give voice, that people should have freedom of expression. That doesn't allow you to overrun another country, because you don't want that for them, because it threatens you and everything you stand for. Look at what President Putin has done in Russia. He has taken more and more control over the past decade of free speech, of the right of people to say, well, hold on, we don't want a war, or we would like to talk about it if we're going to do it. People have been railroaded into this war, and this is a big conflict that threatens the democratic values that much of the world cherishes and upholds, because they think that these are the pillars upon which society we should aspire to going forward. None of it's perfect, but this is what we aspire to. So yes, people are distracted, but it is a very big distraction by somebody who's willing to go to war to trample those values. And the reality is nobody knows where he'll stop, because each time he's been given a margin before, whether it was in Chechnya, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was in Ukraine in 2014, it hasn't stopped. So, the world should hope that President Putin does end this war, because it's in his control to do it. He is invading another country. And then perhaps we can begin to rebuild some of the trust that's getting damaged, the trust that we need internationally to combat climate change.
It's a very interesting connection that you made also between something of a threat on a planetary level to a threat on a national level. And fortunately or unfortunately, the way that the world works right now is that national security and national interest will always trump planetary interests. But
I would say to that, but we are the people, and this is our planet. And democratic society allows you to put up your hand and say, no, we don't want this. We want this. And it is on us. And I hope that this is some of what I can bring and colleagues can bring in their reporting.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that piece of hope and I think also encouragement and motivation for like the power of individual agency. Um, but coming back to my previous question, somewhat related vein of thought. Uh, After the US's sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I connect this here because the effects of war often last much longer than the fighting itself. And so, after the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan in August 2021, we've seen this issue put on a bit of a back burner in international media, even though as we still see a humanitarian crisis that is gradually increasing. The economy is facing huge challenges right now, and then we also see a very real threat of non-state armed groups, coming back into strength, and still active on ground. And the economic crisis is worsening by the day, and has been for nearly a year. And over 90% of households we see have not been able to get enough food. And then we see reports from the International Rescue Committee that says that, if left unaddressed, the current humanitarian crisis itself might result in greater loss of lives than the 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan has cost. So, my question to you on this is, you've covered the conflict in Afghanistan extensively. Has the trajectory of Afghanistan since the US pullout been what you expected over the past year? And keeping in mind the average Afghan citizen who originally suffered after the war on terror began, and now after the US withdrawal from the country, what do you think the future of Afghanistan looks like?
I think it's a very tough future right now. I think that well, I would love to see more world leaders stand up and provide greater humanitarian support. This would be a real positive thing for the people of Afghanistan. And I think nothing would give a journalist who spent so much time covering Afghanistan and loves the people of that country, and feels a very strong connection to it. And nothing would give us greater satisfaction than to be reporting on leaders doing that. At the moment, it really seems like a very, very difficult situation that the Taliban have taken control in a way that's not conducive with the thoughts and beliefs of the countries that provide aid, and that's a conundrum, that needs resolving.
So, on the Russia-Ukraine war, could we have a recap from you and a short window into the future? How do you see this war unfolding in the immediate future, and where do you see the war going from here? Are we looking at more escalations? What hopes do we have for a solution at the end of the conflict, and what will need to happen for it to be achieved?
I think the war is going to go on for some time. I don't see an immediate end to it. I think that the evidence coming from the Kremlin at the moment is that they continue to think that they can continue with A, the illegal annexations, and B, try to prosecute this invasion. And continue to fight the way they fought, despite the international community saying, look, the way to end the war is for you to pull your troops out. President Putin doesn't seem to be willing to do that at the moment. So I don't see a negotiated solution happening soon. I do think the Ukrainians, despite the fact that the electricity and gas and heating and water is being targeted across the whole country, civilians are being targeted in this war, completely separate to the battle on the front lines. I don't see Ukrainian morale, the morale of the soldiers or the morale of the people, dropping. In fact, the more the people get targeted, the stronger they get in support for their troops, in support for what they're doing, and in their anger and frustration with Russia. President Putin is creating an enemy here. So the resolution to this, it is going to get much harder. So I do think the fighting is going to continue. I do think that over time, Ukraine will take more territory. And I do think that President Putin is ultimately going to face the shortcomings of this illegal invasion. And that's going to be what we've already seen, the erosion of his political capital at home. And that's going to threaten his position in power. And so, I think we should worry about how he is going to respond to that. That's what I see happening in the conflict.
Right.
There is, of course, always opportunity for peace, but this is an illegal invasion of a population that rejects the invasion, and they will do their best to stand their ground, despite everything.
Thank you so much, Nic Robertson, for joining us today. It's been an insightful conversation. I've learned so much, and thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences from this conflict and from your work in the past as well. Thank you so much for tuning in and staying with us through this very interesting conversation with one of the world's leading conflict journalists. We work very hard to bring you conversations like these, and we'd really appreciate your support if you could subscribe to our channel. And if you don't want to miss any updates from us, please press the bell icon as well. Thank you.